Russia is pouring every resource into its war in Ukraine. Under President Vladimir Putin's command, the Kremlin has transformed the nation into a wartime economy. A massive portion of Russia's resources is now funneled into Putin's invasion of Ukraine, despite losing thousands of soldiers monthly in the brutal war machine he created. This not only weakens Russia's military, but also drains its high-quality manpower, from battle-hardened troops to seasoned security experts who could otherwise bolster domestic security. This situation cannot persist indefinitely, and collapse looms closer. Putin's days in power are numbered as a string of failures in Ukraine fuels internal chaos in Russia. Despite his efforts to conceal it, the signs of weakening control are clear. His grip on Russia falters due to a narrow focus on the Ukraine invasion. But before diving into today's main topic, comment 1 if you support Ukraine, 2 if you support Russia, or 3 if you're neutral. Now let's get into today's video content. That's the perspective of Emily Ferris, a senior Russia analyst at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. In an article published on September 23rd, Ferris laid out her stance. She argued that the Ukraine war has distracted Russia from internal issues, leading to serious domestic security challenges. Uneven gaps in Russia's ability to address internal security threats like terrorism and regional unrest are creating a volatile mix that could erupt into widespread chaos. Signs of this are already emerging. Just look at Russia's domestic terrorism situation. Sporadic attacks in regions like Dagestan and Chechnya expose the weaknesses of Russia's security agencies and fuel public discontent, especially among ethnic minority communities, where feelings of abandonment by the central government are growing stronger. Ferris contends that Putin has allocated too many of Russia's resources to portraying Ukraine as a giant enemy, creating blind spots within Russia itself. These blind spots allow internal adversaries to exploit urgent security issues, including domestic terrorism, without resistance. In a September 25 interview with Times Radio, Ferris explained, "In a war where vast resources are committed to the front lines, it creates domestic security gaps in Russia." She expanded on this in her article, noting that terrorist activity inside Russia has surged since Putin launched the Ukraine invasion. Instead of heeding intelligence assessments and addressing these issues before they escalate into major attacks, Putin diverts Russia's limited domestic resources to what he deems more critical, hunting down and suppressing his political rivals. This overwhelms agencies like the FSB, not just due to manpower shortages, but also because resources are misallocated to controlling ideology rather than countering real threats. A stark example of this lack of will and resources is the terrorist attack at Crocus City Hall. On March 22, 2024, Moscow suffered one of Russia's worst terrorist attacks, just days after Putin's election to a 5th term, but before his May 7 inauguration. 4 terrorists stormed the Crocus City Hall theater in Russia's capital, armed with automatic AK-47 rifles, and began firing. They also carried Molotov cocktails, sparking a massive fire that killed many victims through smoke inhalation and burns. The massacre left at least 149 Russian civilians dead and 609 others injured. The Islamic State, IS, claimed responsibility for the attack. The 4 main suspects charged with the attack hailed from Tajikistan, though more than 4 individuals were detained in connection. Tajikistan is notable, having gained independence from Russia after the Soviet Union's collapse, but still relying on Russia for security and economic support, meaning Russia's weakening affects Tajikistan too. This weakening also fuels labor migration from Tajikistan to Russia, allowing extremists to blend in and operate undetected. Located in Central Asia, where Russia holds significant influence, Tajikistan contributes to Russia's domestic terrorism challenges. Ferris emphasized that the Crocus City Hall attack was entirely preventable if Russia had prioritized it. She pointed out multiple opportunities for security agencies, particularly the FSB, to anticipate and stop the attack, with some intelligence not even classified. The US warned Russia before the attack, as did Iran. Ferris noted that Moscow's dismissal of US warnings as politicized is understandable, but ignoring clear warnings from an ally like Iran is baffling. According to some sources, these warnings included specific details about the attack's timing and potential location, yet Russia seemingly failed to implement necessary precautions, such as bolstering security at major public venues. One cannot help but question why Russia did so little to prevent the Crocus City Hall attack despite having intelligence. Some conspiracy theories suggest Russia deliberately ignored warnings to blame Ukraine for civilian deaths. Indeed, immediately after the attack, senior Russian officials directly accused Ukraine and the West of involvement, even claiming Ukraine might not have acted directly but was willing to harbor terrorists. Ukraine dismissed these accusations as lies per the BBC. Perhaps these accusations were a distraction from a graver issue. Russia may have intended to act before the Crocus City Hall attack, but couldn't due to resources being tied up in Ukraine. Putin might have dismissed warnings, hoping they were false, while continuing to pour Russia's resources into the Ukraine war. Ferris also noted that domestic terrorism is rising in Russian regions where the FSB was likely stretched thin before the war and is now barely functional. She highlighted increased attacks on religious sites in the North Caucasus and reports of prison riots in Russia, partly due to the Kremlin's heavy-handed and ineffective approach to terrorism. This shift in Russia is reflected in travel warnings from Western governments. For instance, the UK warned that terrorist groups are active in the North Caucasus and have carried out multiple attacks in Dagestan. While Russian security forces conduct counter-terrorism operations, the UK government notes these are often rushed. These operations lack coordination between agencies and rely on inaccurate intelligence, allowing terrorists to escape or continue operations. An attack in June 2024, just months after Crocus City Hall, killed at least 20 people at churches and synagogues. The Suffin Center noted that this terrorism surge is not surprising. Before Crocus City Hall, individuals from the North Caucasus were responsible for most terrorist attacks in Russia, highlighting the failure of Russian security agencies to address rising extremism in the region. The Suffin Center pointed out that jihadist elements arrived in the North Caucasus after the First Chechen War, ended in 1996, and the Second, meaning extremism in the region has simmered for decades. The Chechen Wars left a legacy of violence and created a generation of trained, action-ready extremists who exploit current chaos to launch attacks. Once again, the Ukraine war provides opportunities for extremists to strike, knowing security forces are too weak to stop them. This ties into Russia's sacrificial pawn approach in the Ukraine war. Beyond depleting equipment, the sheer number of personnel Russia loses in Ukraine severely impacts domestic security. In a July 2024 article, The National Interest called Putin's strategy ruthless, noting his willingness to sacrifice soldiers for territorial gains. This strategy not only causes massive casualties, but also erodes Russia's ability to maintain high-quality military units, as well-trained soldiers are sent to the most dangerous fronts without protection plans. Many soldiers Russia sends to the front are meant to exhaust Ukraine's ammunition, weakening its defenses for subsequent attacks. The national interest argued that this approach is fracturing Russia's very structure as a nation. According to Ukraine's finance ministry, as of September 28, Putin's strategy has cost Russia over 1.108 million soldiers. This includes those killed, severely wounded, and unable to serve, and deserters fleeing harsh battlefield conditions. Consider what this means for Russia's domestic security. In terms of direct losses, FSB members have died in Putin's war. A notable example, in July, saw Ukraine eliminate 2 members of a covert Russian intelligence cell operating in Ukraine, responsible for assassinating a Ukrainian intelligence colonel. These FSB agents are resources Russia typically uses for domestic issues, so their deployment to Ukraine shows where Putin prioritizes resources. Losing FSB agents not only weakens counter-terrorism capabilities, but also creates gaps in domestic intelligence gathering, critical for preventing attacks like Crocus City Hall. Add to that the soldiers who could have become future FSB agents but are now lost in Ukraine, and Russia faces a dual crisis, losing current and potential FSB members. Beyond direct losses, the massive casualties from Putin's sacrificial pawn approach are sparking outrage, especially in Russia's remote regions. Since 2023, reports indicate ethnic minority communities are disproportionately recruited and killed. For example, ethnic groups in regions like Buryatia and Tuva have seen unusually high death tolls, with many families losing breadwinners, fueling growing resentment toward the central government. This effectively encourages extremism and, by extension, terrorism, as families lose fathers and sons, fostering anger toward Putin that is increasingly evident as Russia's security agencies falter. Ferris summed it up. Something is simmering beneath Russia's societal surface, and I think it's quite concerning. The obvious question is what, if anything, Putin is doing to address this increasingly dangerous domestic security issue. The answer was hinted at earlier. Putin is using most domestic security resources not deployed to Ukraine to suppress criticism of the war. This is a major issue, circling back to Ferris's point that Putin's narrow focus is solely on the Ukraine war. Every decision revolves around this invasion, and it's paralyzing Russia. This focus not only undermines domestic security, but also erodes public trust in the government, as citizens see domestic issues like terrorism and unrest go unaddressed. On September 22nd, the Associated Press published an analysis of a report by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Russia, Mariana Katsarova. She stated, "Repression is escalating and becoming large-scale." Katsarova's report highlighted that Russian security forces are using increasingly harsh measures, including arbitrary arrests and violence, to silence any voices opposing the war. This shows Putin prioritizes targeting ideological opponents of the Ukraine invasion over the growing threat of domestic terrorism. Russia's authorities have ramped up every measure to enforce the repression Putin desires, with a sharp increase in criminal prosecutions, prolonged detentions, and torture, all aimed at dissidents and journalists rather than potential terrorists. Simply speaking out about the Ukraine war can make anyone in Russia a target. At its core, Putin is doing what he does best: deceiving. The strategy behind Russia's repression is to eliminate any influential voices that contradict the Kremlin's narrative. Putin wants the public to believe Russia is winning the war. He also aims to ensure reports of Russia's growing domestic security issues never reach those who could, if they rose up, become Ukraine's only chance to oust Putin. If there's any doubt about what Putin seeks, Katsarova's figures tell a detailed story. According to the AP, Katsarova's report noted that from mid-2024 to mid-July 2025, prosecutions to suppress dissent in Russia surged, with at least 3,905 individuals convicted of administrative or criminal offenses for peaceful dissent. Russia also labeled 150 children aged 14 to 17 as terrorists or extremists during that period, showing a heavy-handed approach to terrorism. This labeling is not only morally shocking, but also alienates a younger generation that could become a future force of opposition. Additionally, the AP reported that 1,040 individuals and organizations, about a quarter of them journalists, were designated by Russia as foreign agents. Russia's repression issue concerning journalism will be addressed further later. For now, the focus is on the foreign agent label. According to Mediazona, in the summer of 2023, Russia's State Duma passed new amendments to the foreign agent law, allowing Russia to classify any individual or organization suspected of receiving foreign funding as a foreign agent. This law is designed to isolate and neutralize anyone daring to share information contradicting the Kremlin's official narrative, especially those exposing truths about war failures or domestic security issues. Consider what this means. In a nation where the state controls information flow, the only outlet for alternative perspectives may be seeking foreign funding. These foreign agents don't follow the Kremlin's line. The amendments also expanded the law to include any individual, even ordinary citizens, with provisions that could punish someone for contributing to a foreign agent's work. So, if an average Russian consumes media produced by someone funded from outside Russia, they could face fines of $360 to $600 to correct the violation. This creates a climate of fear, where citizens hesitate to access independent information, reinforcing Putin's control over public opinion. Through the 2023 amendments, Russia grants itself the power to use technicalities to punish anyone opposing what Putin wants reported domestically. By penalizing citizens for merely interacting with a foreign agent, Putin also tries to steer Russians away from anything that could harm his image, including reports of domestic terrorism linked to the Ukraine invasion. Ordinary citizens can be punished for nearly any interaction, as Mediazona explained. For example, rapper Legalize was fined for a Telegram post promoting a music video he made with another foreign agent, animator Pavel Munchin. In St. Petersburg, Orthodox priest Grigory Mikhnov-Vitenko was fined for reposting an article from Bumaga, a local independent media outlet. These examples show the granular level of control Russian authorities impose, targeting even seemingly harmless acts to silence opposition. Russia is doubling down on this approach to suppress information. On September 25, the Moscow Times reported that the Kremlin is moving to tighten already unfair foreign agent laws further. If the new amendments pass, a single violation of these vague laws could lead to criminal prosecution, whereas currently at least 2 violations are required before Russia can pursue criminal charges. This means anyone, from journalists to ordinary citizens, could face prison for a single social media post or public comment against the war. This all aims to hide information more easily, which leads to Russia's issue with journalists. As mentioned, about a quarter of those labeled foreign agents are journalists. These are the people who could report on Russia's misuse of resources to support Putin's Ukraine invasion, if not silenced by the Kremlin's ever-changing laws. This circles back to Ferris's point in her RUSI article and Times Radio interview. Resources Russia should use to address domestic security issues are instead spent detaining journalists and other non-criminal individuals labeled as foreign agents. These people are rarely the type of dissidents capable of harming Russia through terrorism. They are thinkers and speakers, influential philosophical opponents who simply offer a perspective different from the Kremlin-approved narrative about Putin's invasion. And when fining and detaining citizens and journalists isn't enough, Russia has another approach. Katsarova stated, "Torture and ill treatment in the Russian Federation remain widespread and systematic, affecting not only Russian citizens, but also Ukrainian prisoners of war and detained civilians." She described torture methods including beatings, electric shocks, and detention in harsh conditions, all aimed at forcing compliance or extracting information from dissidents. She reported at least 258 cases of torture by law enforcement and prison staff during her survey period.
Russia also seeks to reduce external oversight of torture against dissidents. On September 3, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights reported that Russia plans to withdraw from the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture (CPT) framework. Discovering torture becomes far harder when external inspection bodies are barred from entering Russia to investigate. This plan is part of Russia's broader strategy to block international human rights monitoring, concealing serious violations. This is repression doubled. Russia uses torture to silence those who cannot be silenced through fines and detention, while suppressing the ability of external agencies to report on this torture, meaning ordinary Russians are less likely to know what's truly happening in their country.
That's the goal. The Kremlin wants to control the narrative and is creating the legal frameworks to do so. But in doing so, it fails to address the domestic issues Putin's war has created. Internal chaos is coming, no matter how much Putin and his allies try to hide it from the Russian people. Too many resources are devoted to the Ukraine war, too few to handling domestic problems. It's a recipe from which Russia may never recover. As of September 30, 2025, the Ukraine war has inflicted severe losses on Russia across multiple fronts. According to reports from Ukraine's defense ministry and independent sources, Russia has lost over 1.108 million soldiers, including those killed, severely wounded, and deserters. In terms of equipment, Russia has lost thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, and artillery systems, with estimated material damages reaching tens of billions of dollars. Western economic sanctions have crippled Russia's economy, with GDP plummeting and inflation soaring, pushing many Russians into poverty. These figures reflect not only material losses, but also a deep fracture in Russia's social and political structure, as the nation pays a steep price for Putin's ambitions. Comment 1 if you support Ukraine, 2 if you support Russia, or 3 if you're neutral.